Yeah, so tonight we're going to launch this book, and I've called my message tonight, Jesus in a World of Colliding Empires, the story of a book. So I'm going to sort of narrate the story of the book as well as tell you what's in it to some extent. So maybe give you a taster of what the book's about. The book originated actually through my study of Philippians. I published a commentary on Philippians last year, and a lot of the time I spent in that work was focusing on Philippians 2, which I had studiously avoided in my doctoral thesis because I knew that if I went there, it would have lengthened my doctoral thesis by about 3 years' study. And when I got there, I found that what you see here, I think, is a crystal summary of Mark's gospel, where you have Jesus being in the form of God, not considering equality with God something to be grasped or exploited, and this is my own translation from my commentary, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. And the idea there is that he poured himself out for the world. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And what you have there is a summary of the story of the gospel, beautifully summarized. And as I studied that, I sort of looked into the background of this, and those of you who have looked at this passage know that there are a variety of ideas out there as to what Paul has in mind as a contrast to Jesus here. And some would say it's Adam, some would say it's Satan, some would say that it's Alexander the Great, others would say that it's Nero, who was the emperor at the time. And my conclusion was that it's all of the above, that really he's putting Jesus up against all political figures who come the way the world expects them to come, with harpagmos, which is a Greek word that is used of rapacious force, violence. The verb is harpazo, to grab something and rip it out of a context. It's used of the rapture, actually, for those of you interested in eschatology. So Jesus did not do that. He came in a way the world didn't expect. And so as I was doing all this work, I've been teaching New Testament introduction for 13 years now. I have a 3-volume introduction to the New Testament coming out the next couple of years as a result of that work. And I was looking at Mark's gospel, and I realized that Philippians 2 is a beautiful, crisp, hymnic summary of Mark's gospel. Now, I think as I look at Mark's gospel, and this is sort of where I focused my attention for the study, although I allowed myself to be a little bit loose and jump into Matthew and Luke as I felt led, or John, because I wasn't writing something that's an absolute academic commentary. I suggest there's 3 levels to Mark's gospel. Level 1 is what the disciples experienced as they walked with Jesus. So this is taking the view that Mark's gospel is historical. What did those people experience as Jesus was doing his thing? Level 2 is what Mark wants us to hear. So you've got their experience, and then Mark writing after the event of the death of Jesus, and in fact 30 years or so later, looking back. Now, there's an interplay of level 1 and 2 that I believe is ironical and almost humorous as you read Mark's gospel, because the disciples consistently misunderstand Jesus. And you'll have seen this yourself, but I would suggest to you that if you were a Jew in the first century with Jesus, you would have misunderstood him. I'm completely confident that everyone in this room would have, and I'll tell you why later. A good example of the irony is when Peter rebukes Jesus. Peter confesses, "You're the Messiah," and Jesus says, using the Greek word rebuke, rebukes them, telling them to be silent. And then he says, "The Son of Man must suffer and die." Peter then rebukes Jesus, which is an interesting thing to do to someone you've just said is a Messiah, which is quite humorous, really, dark humor. And then Jesus rebukes Satan. So you've got this wonderful interplay going on here. And I find that really funny, although I don't think it's intended to be funny because it's dead serious. On the Mount of Transfiguration, when Peter says, "I'll build you 3 tents," and I'm going to come back to that a bit later, that is very interesting because Peter is operating at one level, but there's another level in Jesus' mind and in God's mind in that situation. Anyway, now most commentators who write on Mark's gospel, and indeed on all the gospels, focus on level 2. That is what Mark wants us to hear. And they say, this is redaction criticism, those of you who've studied. What is the author intending to say? But by doing that, they completely miss the double layer that's going on, where you've got this thing moving through, where you can look at each passage and go, what are they thinking? And then what does Mark want us to hear? Which I believe is what Jesus wants us to hear. But they are constantly misunderstanding that. And I believe that this highlights a big weakness in contemporary scholarship, probably because of the fear of getting caught embroiled in historicity discussions. Do what I do, I just say whether it's historical or not, Mark believes it is. And then you can play. And I'm a person of faith and I believe it is. So I don't allow myself to be held back by that question, although there's 1,000 questions we could ask about the historicity of Mark's gospel. But I think you've got to know level 1, what the disciples are experiencing, and then level 2, what Mark wants, to understand level 3, which is our situation as we read Mark. If we're going to understand Mark, we've got to know the interplay that's going on, or else we miss, in our social context, the brilliant subversion of the story. It is a sensational story, as are all the Gospels. And we need to unmask, and we fail to unmask the empires that we're all in. Because we're in them empires, whether we admit it or not. Like the Western hegemony of America and Britain and New Zealand and Australia, who are the good guys, aren't they? And the bad people, the axis of evil, as George Bush once put it. If we don't have that ability to recognize the interplay in the Bible, then we don't see it in our own setting. So let me tell you about the book. So in the introduction, I sort of talk about my journey from Philippians to Mark, which I've kind of summarized for you. And then in chapter 1, I talk about the setting of Mark's gospel, and it's extremely important to understand the setting of any New Testament book, but I think particularly the Gospels. And I play with this idea. It's interesting that the name Mark, and I should know this because I'm talking about Mark, comes from Mars, the god of war. And I pondered whether, in the book I just pondered whether he actually adopted a name Mark, that isn't his real name, just as a pseudonym, because there's a play there. But then I backed off that and said probably not true, but I thought it was interesting anyway. And then I land where most scholars land, is that, well, to those who give a good credence to early church history, is that Mark is essentially Peter's gospel. And of course, Peter is the main character in Mark's gospel aside from Jesus. It's set in Rome, and at that time, Nero is the emperor, and Nero is going mad. We know sometime around the writing of Mark's gospel, he kills the Christians for the fire of Rome, and he blames them. So Christians are under stress. You've also got, in Israel, you've got the Messianic, or the Zealot movement that's beginning to boil. That's going to culminate in the war in which Rome destroys Israel and the temple, and it still lies destroyed today. So nationalism is on the rise. And it's a time of chaos because Nero is inflicting punishment on anybody he considers a threat. And of course, the other thing I say is that to understand the story of Jesus, you've got to understand Mark, because Mark is the basis of 2 of the other Gospels. So unless we can really get our heads around Mark, we're not going to understand Jesus. Because when Matthew and Luke write their Gospels, they take Mark's account and they take it and adapt it in the directions they want. So again, I say the importance of understanding this. Chapter 2, I look at Israel in a world of colliding empires. And I sort of retrace in quite summative terms what we all know about Israel at the time, is that they had been part of a sequence of empires. The story of Israel going right back to Abraham, he ends up in Egypt, and then you've got the Exodus, you've got Moses, the liberation, which of course is the central event in Jewish history. You've got the wilderness wanderings, and then of course the conquest, where a certain Joshua took the land of Canaan on behalf of God, and they subjugated the nations and laid claim to that piece of land, which is still a living political issue today, isn't it? And then of course after that, when they were in the land, they then themselves faced exiles, and the Assyrians conquered the north, the Babylonians conquered the south. They were liberated by the Medo-Persians. They came back into Israel, and they were under, for a while, Medo-Persian rule, then Greek rule, Alexander the Great, and then a period of the Maccabees, and then the Romans. So Israel lives and dwells in a world of colliding empires. This is their story. And then I asked the question, what was the rest of the world doing at this time? And this wasn't easy because I'm not really the world's greatest historian, so I had to play in fields that were slightly out of my field. But I went searching around for anything I could find on the history of India, the history of China, the history of Russia, the history of Africa, and I spent ages sort of reading all sorts of obscure books I've never looked at before. I must admit I didn't read as much as I should have. And I found that the same patterns of power are found right across all these empires. And I don't think I'm the first to suggest this. Men rule the roost. Okay, sorry girls. But there's still room for lots of women because they always want lots of women so they can have lots of kids to maintain the name and the inheritance, although that often backfires because one of the kids kills the other kid. And so you've got that story in Judges of Abimelech. If you haven't read that story, go home and read that. I'll mention him again later. They become dynastic because they want to pass it on to their favoured son, or the sons beat each other up, or a cousin or something. And then with warriors and armies, certainly in the early phase, they extend the kingdom or they defend it. And so in the Roman world at the time of the New Testament, Rome is expanding still. Okay? Julius Caesar, of course, set it on its way. Claudius would conquer Britain, sort of. Yes, sort of. And then from tribes, and then in parts of the world, say Germany or Britain, you had more of a tribal arrangement. But these tribes were still built on the same basic foundation. And sometimes the tribes would coalesce into big groups to fight and defend themselves. So the German tribes beat off the Romans in the early part of the 1st century, as an example. Wealth was very important, essential to fund the empire. There were different ways of maintaining stability. One was benefaction. In other words, you would be nice to those people who would just support you. You would grant them citizenship. You would allow Herod, who was a descendant of the Hasmonean Empire, which was Israel's little golden period, to be a client king. And you would allow the locals, and the Romans were very good at this, to have a degree of autonomy as much as possible without it becoming a threat to the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. But force would be used where necessary. So in AD 66 to 70, I've mentioned this all, you have the destruction of Israel. And of course, these situations are always the easy way or the hard way. The negotiation would go like this: we surrender or we'll destroy you. You won't surrender, we'll destroy you. So you get this in, say, Pergamum, the city that is in Revelation, where when the Romans came to Pergamum, they came out and welcomed them in and gave them the city. And of course, Pergamum was a beautiful, favoured city. It was never destroyed. And then, of course, you get the progressive decline. You get a golden age, I could have added there, a progressive decline in the replacement by a new warrior king. So you have this kind of cycle that goes on in the ancient world, and empires rise and fall, and there's that great poem, Ozymandias. Go home and read Ozymandias. I learnt it when I was in the 5th form. Great, great poem. Chapter 4, I look at Israel's story, and I thought, is Israel itself any different in the way they function as a nation? One thing I could have added in the previous slide was there's always a religious dimension to an ancient empire. They always have their religious dimension which is fused with the political. And I should have mentioned that because when you come into the story of Israel, you have the same dynamics going on in Israel. As I've mentioned, they had their period in the Exodus and God liberated them with military force. And of course, in this instant, they had God on their side who caused the Pharaoh's army to be drowned. And so they were there, the victims of subjugation, and then they were liberated. And so you have that pattern of death and resurrection and this desire for liberation. The conquest, I believe, is totally underrated in reading the Gospels. It's amazing if you go into EBSCO, which is this massive search engine looking for academic works, and put Jesus as the new Joshua. I found one German article. How strange when his name is Joshua. How strange. Or his mission as a new conquest. I think I found 2, again, in German. So this is something that interests me because I think at the most foundational level, Jesus is the new Joshua. That's really who he should be understood as. After all, when he was named by God, he was named Joshua, which is in Greek, Jesus, Jesus. Anyway, going back to Israel, you have the Judges story. Now there's a cycle in Judges. Those of you who have studied Judges know this well. Israel has a period of peace, it declines. It's interpreted that their religious allegiance is compromised by idolatry. There's an oppressor, a foreign nation, and then a warrior is raised up, often a very reluctant figure, usually with some kind of interesting thing about them, like Gideon was terrified. And then Deborah, of course, a woman, so girls, you're back in the game. And then there's a period of peace, and then the cycle goes on again. So you have this cycle. There's no kingship yet, but you've got the same patterns rolling in. And then monarchy comes in. Now, monarchy doesn't come in 1 Samuel 8. Monarchy comes in Judges with a certain Abimelech, who was the first king of Israel. He's not the first legitimate king. He's the first one who appoints himself king. He's one of the sons of Gideon. He's an illegitimate son. He kills off 69 of the 70 brothers. Bad mistake. If you're going to be an emperor, you kill all the others. You don't leave anyone living, because they will come back to haunt you. That's why Darth Vader was so desperate to get rid of Luke. Anyway, so Abimelech is king for 3 years, and then the curse placed on him by the other son of Gideon comes to pass. He dies, but then in 1 Samuel you get this desire for a king. And so you have the first king, Saul, anointed by a prophet, Samuel. Then you have his failure. Then you have David, anointed by a prophet, Samuel, followed by Solomon, who's anointed by the prophet Nathan. And so you have the sequence. David is the warrior king who brings peace. He vanquishes the Philistines and others and brings peace. So he establishes Israel as it should be, as told by God, their God, in the land. Along comes Solomon. He's allowed to build the temple because he's not a man of war, and Israel has this beautiful period of peace. But of course, the seeds of its destruction are laid by Solomon, although the wisest man in the world was a bit of an idiot politically. Because what he did was he used the northern people and he abused them in his lavish undertakings of armies and harems and building projects. And so when Rehoboam succeeded Solomon, the northerners said, "Are you going to treat us the way that Solomon did?" And of course, Rehoboam went away, went against advice and said, "Yeah, we're going to make it worse." So Jeroboam led a rebellion, which was prophesied by a prophet, and you had the split of the north and the south. And then you have the story of two empires and the intermingling of those empires with the worlds around them. And you have basically the movement into decline, where the golden age of David and Solomon fades away. The north is conquered by Assyria, and then the south is conquered by Babylon, and they go into exile. There's nothing really different in that story to the world around them. Israel is under foreign rule from that time on. Even when they come back in the south from Judah, from Babylon, they are under Cyrus, the Medo-Persians, then the Greeks, and so it goes on. But this hope starts to rise within them from their prophets that God, their emperor, or his agent of various descriptions, will liberate them and bring God's kingdom to pass, or his reign and his rule. And Israel will be free, and not only that, but the whole world would be at peace. The nations will be bringing tribute. This is a language of imperial domination and global subjugation. So this is a vision of Israel having a world empire, basically in the same patterns that we've understood. There was a period of the Maccabeans when they rebelled against the Seleucids. Many of you will know this story. It became too much for Judas Maccabees, and he led a rebellion which developed into the Hasmonean Empire. So they had their own golden age. When Jesus steps onto the scene, not that long after the Hasmoneans were there, that's still looked on as a sort of template of what could happen as Jesus steps into history. The other thing that people like N.T. Wright have told us is that there's a whole lot of messianic movements going as well. And it's interesting, they're all clumped together beautifully in Josephus. You can go and read Josephus and read about all these characters like Judas, the son of Hezekiah, Simon of Perea, Athronges, and so on. Some who are mentioned in the Bible. And what's interesting about them all is that they're the same pattern of person. They're big guys. You know, I might have been a candidate back then. And they get some of their mates and say, let's sort out the Herodians and the Romans, who are the bad guys, the Herodian Empire, sitting nestled under the Roman Empire. And so they'll go and plunder one of Herod's armories. They'll grab all his weapons and start killing anybody who they see as a traitor or a rebel, believing that God would join them in the fight and bring victory. Does that sound familiar? You mentioned something about Islamic State. Islamic State is a very helpful thing. We don't like the idea of Islamic State, but it's very helpful for us to understand the mindset of the people at the time of Jesus, or certainly large numbers of them. Not everyone in Israel thought the same way, but certainly a large number of them, I believe, were hoping for God's military intervention on their behalf. In chapter 5, I look into this expectation and I label the figure Theo, which is a good word because it's the expected one, but it also Theos, God. So there's a double play here. Anyway, I call him the expected one, and I must admit that I do coalesce a lot of divergent ideas in Judaism, arguing that they're all militaristic. I think they're all distinct. So you've got the prophet, who's based on Deuteronomy 18. You've got a Messiah who's Davidic, who will be a Davidic ruler. You've got the Son of Man figure who's found in Daniel 7 and then in 1 Enoch, and there's a range of other ones. Now, as I looked into them, I found that all of them have in common, at some point there'll be a militaristic dimension to them to establish God's reign on earth. Some of them actually believe God himself will do it. He'll just step in and bring about his reign. So there's a wide range of expected figures and processes, yet there's always violence. Even where the figure is the servant figure, which is where we like to go as Christians into Isaiah 53. And we find this wonderful figure who is not a violent man. He's a victim of violence, and his life is given as a vicarious sacrifice for the people of Israel, the sheep who have gone astray. And the real Messiah in Isaiah's writings in Isaiah 40 is Cyrus. So the prototype for Jesus when we come to Mark's Gospel is actually a Medo-Persian king, which is pretty controversial because he's a Gentile. But so you've got this sort of, so what I did was I went in and I looked for every reference I could find in the Old Testament and in the writings of Judaism that referred to these figures. So I spent hours using search engines. By the way, there's some really great search engines out there on Bible software. And in every part of the New Testament, of the Old Testament, you might find a sort of oracle of peace that looks like a Messiah as we would understand Jesus, but read around the context and you will find bloodshed everywhere. This is a brutal world. This is a world like Syria. And the problem for us today is we don't know this world. And the last time we knew this world, we were the ones going shedding blood. I'm talking to the white people in the room here. Apologies to everybody from another culture that people of my heritage did that too. It's horrible. But we were the ones, and that's why I think some of these ideas are not acknowledged enough by people of white skin because, you know, we were the ones doing it. And so now we're looking at a world and we're disturbed and we see the rise of empires everywhere, isn't it? Wow. This is the world that they lived in, but far, far worse. Anyway, there's no idea of a servant king, although the texts are there. So that's why when Jesus turns up, no one gets it. So when you go to Jewish thinking about Isaiah 53, which we read that and go, Jesus, they didn't associate that with the Messiah. They associate that with a variety of options, but it's not till later Targums will associate it with the Messiah. So there's this blind spot here in Israel's thought, but it's a blind spot that we would have had if we were there. Because that's not the world. No one's contemplated an option different. It's embedded in the prophets, but I'm not even sure the prophets themselves would have fully understood this, which is okay because prophecy is seeing through a mirror dimly in 1 Corinthians 13, right? So we only see this stuff looking back. And that's why no one recognized Jesus as a servant king until, would you believe it, the thief on the cross, who's a rebel, who's trying to work with Barabbas, he's named Barabbas a son of God, which is very ironic and funny. And he is leading a rebellion and he is released by Pilate. The crowd wants a rebel. They don't want Jesus, which is interesting because later on they're going to attack the Romans and not take the path that Jesus offers them. And the thief on the cross says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That's a prophetic statement. So somehow in that moment, that guy got it. Others recognized Jesus like Bartimaeus. Peter recognized that Jesus was Messiah. In John's gospel, Martha did. Yet, these people did not understand the full implications of who Jesus is. Because once he was on the cross, his disciples were totally disillusioned. This can't be the Messiah, or else he wouldn't be on a cross. Even though Jesus had said it 3 times, because it's not in their worldview. And then there's the Roman soldier who says, surely this is the Son of God. How ironic that it's a Roman who sees that. So I pulled together a composite picture of what I believe many in Israel thought, and it was a dominant view, and this is why what Jesus walked into, is there would be a theo-warrior king to establish God's reign. Israel would be restored by military force, the Gentiles vanquished. Effectively a new conquest with a Joshua figure. And this is why I think the name of Jesus must have been very interesting to them, particularly when he chose 12 apostles, which is very provocative because as they traveled through the wilderness, their arrangement was military. It was a military arrangement. As they traveled through the wilderness with the tabernacle in the center, that's how the ancients arranged their military establishments. Then, of course, there must be world conquest. God in some way is going to take his world. There's no description of that in the Jewish writings that I've found. So you just have to reason it together that it must involve some kind of military subjugation. Interestingly, Paul's journeys take the path that a Messiah would have taken had he gone on a military conquest to Rome. I find that really interesting. Is that intentional? Did Paul think about that? I don't know. But he ended up in Rome before Caesar, not to talk terms, but to be put to death by him. And that's the pattern of our gospel. Through death and resurrection is change, not through us killing. So it's a different perspective on life. Jerusalem and Zion would be established as the world capital. Jewish law would be the world constitution, as in the case of Sharia law. Islamic State, so think of Hitler and his attempts to conquer. Think of Islamic State. And the Gentiles would become God's people by becoming Jews. Now this comes up in the writings of Paul, where Paul is dealing with people who still have a very Zion-centric view of theology, and many in our churches today still think this is going to happen, to some extent in some transformed way. And of course then God / a messianic figure of some sort would be ruling, and the world would be subjugated willingly or by force. The problem is, just stop and think about that. As good as Jesus was, one guy couldn't do that and manage a whole world at the same time when it had people like me in it who wouldn't want to be ruled. I'm Irish. You know, I'd say, yeah, well, thanks for coming and killing all my family, but as soon as you're gone, mate, we're coming after you. That's the way the world was, and that's the way the world is. And so it's unsustainable. It's impossible. You have to change people at the heart. If you're going to change people, you can't change them with brute force or benefaction, because some people can't be bought off. And if you want to make it force, okay, people are prepared to die to eventually overthrow you, and that's why empires always fall. So it's an unattainable and unsustainable goal. So Mark's gospel tells us a story of a different approach. And in chapter 6 to 15, across the two volumes, the second half of volume 1 and volume 2, I go through and effectively do a kind of a semi-commentary on Mark's gospel. And Jesus is unwrapped to the world by Mark, I think. It's the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Gospel is a fantastic word. It's a Greek word that has its origins in the Roman world, where they sent a message of good news that the Roman Empire was okay because the emperors had a son, or we just beat the Parthians, yay! So everyone got drunk, got laid, and partied to the gods, because the gods were on their side. Jesus Christ, Yesu Christu, Joshua, Yeshua Mashiach, Jesus the Messiah, Joshua the Messiah, the Son of God. Think of Barabbas, the irony there. And so we have this new Joshua and new conquest, but it looks different. Now you can imagine the disciples, when they're with Jesus, imagining at some point he's going to do what the first Joshua did. That's effectively my argument. At some point, he's going to do it. And all this stuff is a great preamble, Jesus, but get on with it. He's anointed the servant king in Mark 1, 12 to 13 by a prophet, John the Baptist. Think back to Samuel. So he's truly the king. So John is the last prophet of the line of prophets who will anoint a messianic king. We don't need them anymore because Jesus is the Messiah, and when we become Christians, we receive his anointing through the Holy Spirit that he places in us. Then in Mark 1:14 to 8:28, Jesus goes on a journey. He calls disciples, and he causes them to be fishers of people. Now, I haven't yet to find anyone in scholarship who's recognized that this is a military term. Because what do you do when you fish? You hook or you net them and you kill them and you eat them, right? So in places like Ezekiel 29, God says to Israel, I'm going to hook you through the nose, a la exile. Babylon's going to do it on my behalf. So it's a war motif. So you can imagine the sons of thunder, James and John, getting really excited. And later on, he gets Simon the Zealot. Oh yeah. And Judas Iscariot, who could be Judas the Sicarii, an assassin. Scholars debate this. So you have a group of his disciples that are macho men, because they're the sort of people you want if you're having an army. They're useless if you want to be a New Testament scholar. Useless. But they're fantastic if you want an army. He appoints 12 of them as apostles, which is nice. And then in Mark 1:21 through to 8:26, he gets to work. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't launch any moves military-wise. He's not gathering an army, although he's gathering disciples. He uses his power for human need. He doesn't even want Israel to recognize him as the Messiah, because every time anybody says you're the Son of God or the Messiah, he says, shh, don't tell anyone. Be silent, demon. This sort of stuff. Because it's not a revolution. He doesn't want a revolution. And when you go to John 6:14 to 15, you've got this wonderful moment where Jesus feeds the 5,000 and the crowd think he's the prophet. 5,000 men fed by Jesus, well fed, it's wartime. And they try to make him king by force, and the Greek word is harpazo, which is related to harpagmos. You see, this is how these things fuse together. Jesus just slips away. So I'm not playing your political games. I'm not getting involved in that. I'm not here for a revolution. And he doesn't do any signs of authentication. So when Moses comes back from the wilderness and he wants Israel to recognize him as their redeemer, what does he do? He throws his spear on the ground. He puts his hand in his shirt and it comes out leprous, and then he puts it back and it's gone. He proves he is God's chosen one. That's what the Pharisees are wanting. Jesus will not have anything to do with it. And in Matthew and Mark, he says the sign of Jonah will do, which is his death and resurrection. But they were drawn to his immense power. This guy can do anything, and potentially he could really be a Messiah, not like these other claimants who are trying to do it. And they followed him and they were drawn to him. And they didn't understand. Then we come to Caesarea Philippi, which is interesting. Caesarea Philippi, Mark 8:29, is agreed to be one of the key turning points in Mark's gospel. Caesarea, named after Caesar, the great Roman warrior king who set up the Roman Empire. Declared himself dictator, got assassinated, and then Augustus came in. In Philippi, which I mistakenly thought was named after Philip of Macedon, but it's actually, as I researched, is Philip the Tetrarch, who's one of the Herodians. So you have the two powers that sit behind Mark's gospel, Rome and Herod. Those of you who have traveled in Israel know how big Herod was, because all the buildings you visit were built by Herod. They're everywhere. He was big. And so you've got the Herodian power and the Roman power, which are antithetical in Mark. There's always this play going on. So in Mark 6, there's this great story where Herod calls a party. He says, come to my party. And he gets all the leaders of Galilee come. The leading people come, and he feeds them up a storm. They all get drunk. Herodias has a boogie. Herod's saying, oh, she's all right. I'll give you half my kingdom. Anything up, what a stupid idiot. And so she has this opportunity to get half of the kingdom of Herod. And she says, I want John the Baptist's head on a platter for dessert. So they bring out John. It's terrible, isn't it? So that's a great Greco-Roman party. That is brilliant. You've got assassination, you've got murder, you've got dancing, you've got sex. I mean, what else could you want? Now down the road, there's Jesus. He's got a crowd of 5,000. Got any food, anyone? They find a couple of fish and a few loaves and he feeds them. Anybody can come. The poor, the disabled, the marginalised. People of other cultures will be there. They'll all have unclean hands. They're breaking all sorts of rules. There's the difference in the kingdoms. Mark 6 tells us everything we need to know, really. Then in Mark, once they've decided and recognised he's the Messiah, Jesus then sets about teaching them what it means to be a servant Messiah, set against the backdrop of their expectations, and most of the time they don't get it, and he's trying to sort them out. They expected him, in my view, at some point to summon Israel's leaders to him and then launch a blitzkrieg on the Romans. But he never did, because that was not his plan. Interestingly, when you go to Caesarea Philippi, it's right up the north, and it would have been a great place to launch an assault from. Let's sweep down through the country and just take him. And I'll talk about the transfiguration in a moment. Now, Mark 8:30 to 9:1, and I'm not the first to say this, a great German scholar has got there first, is a great ancient war speech. It's a war speech. If you hear it with a mindset of war, he says, take up your cross and follow me. We're going to fight the Romans, and some of us are going to get crucified. Who does the crucifying at the time of Jesus? Romans. And then he says, whoever's not for me, no, he says, you've got to deny yourself. It's a summons to war. Don't be ashamed of me before this generation. And then he says, many of you, and you'll see the kingdom of God come in power. Many of you will not taste death until you see the kingdom of God come in power. Some of them are going to live and be alive when we get there. So they're getting really excited that this is going to happen. And then he goes up on the mountain, and Moses and Elijah turn up. Wow. He's got Peter, James, and John. They think they're the best. We know that of James and John, the sons of thunder and Peter. Moses and Elijah aren't there because they're the law and the prophets, although that's a really good piece of thinking. They're there because they're military redeemers. Moses led Israel out of Exodus, and Elijah delivered Israel from the Baal prophets. Now you have two guys back from the dead. You've got Jesus. Peter goes, I'll build you 3 tents. Now, scholars are confused about that all over the world, and with a right click and a few search, I thought I solved it in 5 minutes. The word skene is, in Greek world, a military tent, usually. It's a military establishment. At the centre, you've got a tent for Jesus, and a tent for Moses, and a tent for Elijah. And it's probably connected to the Feast of Tabernacles too, which is possibly on at that time, because there's a lot of hopes around the Feast of Tabernacles. And then from there, Jesus with Moses and Elijah would lead the disciples to take back the land of Canaan. Jesus doesn't want any of that. He says, don't tell anybody about it. What? This isn't the way that a Messiah acts. In Mark 9, 10 to 45, he twice more predicts his death. So 3 times he says he's going to die, but they don't get it because Messiahs kill people. They don't get killed. And they certainly don't get crucified, because cursed is anyone hung on a tree in Jewish thinking. And there's lesson after lesson about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Prayer, humble service, exhibited in children. Permissiveness towards others in ministry. There's a little story about the guys down the road casting out demons, and James and John say, John says, stop them. Jesus says, nah, let them do it, no problem. It's got a lot of applications. Repudiation of sin, using military language. Chop off your arm if it causes you to sin. That's military language, because that's what you do in a war. You go and chop off arms, don't you? There's marital fidelity. We're not going to be like that world who are like Philip, Herod, who married his brother's wife. And in so doing, he sparked a war with the Parthians, which they lost. And of course, Nero was famous for his marriages. He castrated a little boy and married that boy. That's disgusting. This is the stuff they knew about in their culture. We're not like that. The renunciation of the trappings of wealth. When the rich ruler comes, Jesus should have said, well, take your money. That'll be very useful as we smite the Romans. He says, get rid of your money and then come and follow me. He goes, what? What are you on, mate? And he goes away sad. And of course, he feeds and heals the needy. This is our Jesus. The most brilliant contrast, aside from Mark 6, I think, is James and John versus Bartimaeus. James and John come to Jesus, and in one of the other Gospels, the mother is involved, which is classic ancient politics. Mum trying to get the best for her kids. Can we have the sides on your right and left hand in eternity? And what does Jesus, that's right, they come to him, will you do what we want you to do? He says, what do you want me to do for you, is the question Jesus asks. So they ask for the positions of power. Jesus says, that's not for me to give. And then he gives them the lesson on leadership that they need to hear. In the next pericope or so, Bartimaeus is yelling out that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the son of David. He gets called over and says, what do you want me to do for you, says Jesus. Bartimaeus says, I want to see. Jesus heals him. See the difference? He's not going to help someone on their self-arrogation of their life to become a great person. That's not what Jesus is about, because it's about service. But when someone comes with genuine need, I'll use all the power of the cosmos to change your status. And he's the lowest of the low. That's the power of Jesus. He defines leadership as serving. The most important text on leadership in the Bible is Mark 10, 39 to 45. And there's this irony: as they seek power, Jesus says, that's not the way we do it. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Christianity 101. So what are we to do? We're meant to give our lives as a ransom? No, but we give our lives because the ransom's been given, and we serve. So you hear the call of Mark's gospel. He goes into Jerusalem on a donkey. The disciples are heralding him as the Messianic king, singing Psalm 118. Surely it's now. Surely he's going to go and have a talk to Pilate and say, there's two ways we can do this, Pont. The easy way or the hard way. Surely. And when he says, and then he's going to inflict power on him. Did you feel that, brother? No. You're a Pentecostal, though. You wouldn't. Wipe that from the video. No. God bless all Pentecostals. But he attacks Israel's cult. He attacks the temple, the bastion of Israel's religious system. He clears it. He antagonizes the leaders. He stands and uses language from Isaiah and Jeremiah, critiquing their religion. He goes to the Last Supper and he announces the blood of the new covenant. In Greek, that doesn't have to be Jesus' blood. That can be the blood Jesus sheds. Think about that. Those of you who are Greekies, my blood, the natural reading of that is Jesus' blood, but it can actually be the blood Jesus shed. And I wonder what they heard there. And interestingly, in Luke's gospel, the argument of James, the argument about greatness happens there at that situation. It's very interesting. But anyway, we know what that means, that Jesus' blood will be shed as the blood of the new covenant, but do they? Anyway, he goes to his death without a whimper. He refuses to draw in Israel's leadership. He gets into the room with the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin, and he merely affirms who he is and then gets beaten up and taken to the cross. He refuses to confront Pilate and he acquiesces to his death. And he dies on the cross of a rebel Barabbas, the Son of God. They preferred rebellion and they paid the price for that. That temple still lies in ruins today because there was a new temple before their eyes called Jesus and they missed him. And then there's the resurrection, which in Mark's gospel ends very strangely with the woman bewildered and afraid. And I believe that's a brilliant, intentional ending which brings the reader to the place of Mark 4:29. Who is this man? Who then is this? In Mark 4:29, who calms the winds and waves. Here it's who died and rose again. That's the question that he wants readers to negotiate with. Luke and Matthew weren't satisfied and added the appearance stories in. Luke 24 tells us what happens next. They were immediately disillusioned. Jesus is no longer the Messiah. He's only a prophet, Jesus of Nazareth. And we thought he was the one who was going to restore Israel. See, their worldview is too small. They hadn't realized that Jesus' worldview is the whole world. Israel is one of the nations that he's here to restore. Jesus teaches them that the story of God tells us that the Son of Man must suffer and die. This is the only way that the world can be saved. He then starts appearing and he sends them, not on revolution, but a revolution. Take up your cross, take up your towels and follow Jesus. That's the summons of Mark's gospel. Well, with a bit of John. We call this cruciformity. And now I will refer to Michael Gorman. Read Michael Gorman's books. He is the world leader on cruciformity. He supplies the power in Luke's gospel for us to do this, which humans did not have before Jesus came and died for us. The power of the cross is that it cleanses human beings from the sin that we all commit. It solves our heart problem, and then God pours His Spirit into us. And that Spirit is summoning all of us, even in this day, if you're one of the followers of Jesus in this room, to do the things that Jesus is wanting us to do. We know it's to be true because it's in our hearts, isn't it? We want to be loved and we want others to be loved. And we want the people at the edges to be welcomed in. We want people of other cultures to be welcomed. We want women to be placed alongside men. We want to change the world. So, in conclusion, you've got a nice summary of my book. In my conclusion, I go through these headings. The essence of Jesus. And the essence of Jesus is not an imperial dominating ruler like a Caesar or a Nero or Alexander the Great, or even a David, even though David, he's patterned on David in many ways. Humility, these words I love. Service, selflessness, inclusion, embrace. Thank you, Miroslav Volf. Healing, sacrifice. Resurrection, love, revolution. And now we're the ones to do it. The brilliance of the gospel is God now has an army, but not that kind of army. It's so brilliant, and Jesus reigns and His Spirit sends us out to do this work. The rest of the New Testament, I look into the rest of the New Testament and I find the same Jesus everywhere. For example, John 13, Jesus washing feet. Philippians 2, I've mentioned that. 1 Peter 2, magnificent discourse on Isaiah 53 and Jesus as the suffering servant. The Lamb of Revelation, and I could find more. The uniqueness of Jesus. We always think of Jesus in terms of various things that make him unique. Is there anyone that could foresee the story of a world being saved like this? That a king, who is a God, would come to us and do this for us and show us this new way? Isaiah had a glimpse of it. Psalm 22 has a glimpse of it, but not fully developed. It had to be incarnated for us to see it. We had to see it in someone to know what it would look like. And this is, and remember that no one recognized it at the time. So he's a world conqueror, but from the bottom up through humility and service. It's a brilliant strategy, and it's invitational. Come and be a part of it if you want, but if you don't, it's your call. Then I think about Christian history, and it's a story of glory and shame, isn't it? On the one hand, Christians do glorious work, and there's many great aid organisations, and through centuries been great stuff, but what a tragic story it is as well, as we've failed. And I think that one of the things we have to do is go to the world and be open about our failures. I think of colonialism and these other situations in history where we've got harnessed with politics too closely. And effectively, we've become a state religion for an empire. We must never let that happen. And things always get murky when Christianity begins to dominate a culture. We see it in the US today. And I think they are grappling with this question now, aren't they? How do you read the Old Testament if you're reading it through the lens of this Jesus? And I discuss, as other people are discussing at the moment, the question of whether Israel got God wrong as they went through their history. And it wasn't really God talking to them, and we can look back and see the bits where God was talking, where he wasn't. I'm not sure. I back off that a bit because it's got problems, I think, but I still go there and have a think about that. Christian leadership, what does it mean? And I think we have to really take up the challenge as we face a society around us that doesn't really like us much anymore to serve. And we want communities of faith led by cruciform leaders, some of whom will be crucified as they refuse to resort to the patterns of the world to win what they want to win. We do things well in process, serving, leading people from the bottom up. We're those people we're only leaders because we're the chief servant, if anything. Mission, it's got to be through service. We've got to be and do the gospel and then speak. It's through service that we will again see God and Christ recognized in us. We had dinner the other night, Emma and I, with a fella at one of our cyclist friends. He's a great guy. And he simply is not a Christian because he's met too many hypocrites. That's his problem. And I was trying to say, well, that doesn't invalidate Jesus, but it's a tough conversation. And I had to admit that I'm one of those hypocrites. Politics. You know, we have to stop yelling at the world that they've got to live the way we live. Let's wash their feet. Let's heal them. Let's reach out to the margins, and let's be a people of God who don't yell at people how to live. We just live the way we live, walking in the way of Jesus. I think it's got a lot to say about being male. I've written an article on Paul's vision of masculinity, which is a masculinity shaped by cruciformity. And that's what's going on, I believe, in Ephesians 5-6, is he's laying down a foundation for men to live differently. It's not about wives submit to your husbands, because he's got men raising the kids in that passage. I mean, this is really revolutionary stuff. And that it's the pattern of the cross that we're to live out of as men. And we men need to hear the message of cruciformity far louder than women, and it can become a tool of oppression, some feminist writers have said, as it becomes a means to subjugate women. And I think that's a fair criticism. And then I wonder about the second coming. Considering that no Jew recognized Jesus the first time, do we read our scriptures right when we construct our eschatological schemes? And I ponder this question. Is Jesus just going to turn up one day and go, I'm back? And he'd have some scars, and he would go, whoa, and all the cameras of the world go crashing in on him to talk. I don't know. I'm just wondering, because apocalyptic literature is notoriously difficult to interpret. And the Jews at the time of Jesus did not know how to read their own apocalyptic literature well. And so they missed Jesus, many of them. And it was only when he appeared to some of them that they grasped it. So to finish, will we hear the deep magic of the universe? Which I believe this is. This is a bit of C.S. Lewis here. We know this is the right way because our hearts yearn for it. I believe that there are people in the world, these are the people that saw in Jesus as he was healing people what they wanted and needed. And I think our hearts yearn for that, and our hearts yearn for that for the world. And people's hearts out there are yearning for it in a city that is becoming, full of homeless people. Will we hear the whispers of God to us through Jesus and the story, through Jesus and the story of all stories about the King of all kings, and yield to it and join him in his plan to transform a world from the bottom up with people living the pattern of the cross? Will we renounce the patterns of the world obsessed with wealth and consumption and image and charisma and hubris and youth? Not that there's anything wrong with being young, but there's nothing wrong with being old either, for a world shaped by the cross. Will we renounce that? Will we dare to be people who live differently, even if that causes us great pain as it did Jesus? And will the church repent of its failures, its compromise with the false patterns of the world, and become the people God wants us to be? These are questions. And will Christian leaders lead with crosses strapped on our backs? Will we dare to be those leaders? We may not get as much done as quickly. We may not even get there. We may wander in the wilderness. But will we commit to doing that? Thank you for listening. And I finish with this question: what could the world look like if we hear the message of Mark's gospel?